concerned residents dressed as angels to protect the cast from protesters.
This is my town. My kids went to this high school.
Sylvia Guerrero had never even heard the word transgender until her 17-year-old daughter Gwen Araujo, born a son named Eddie, was brutally murdered. On October 4, 2002, Gwen Araujo, a young transgender Lona, was brutally murdered by three men she considered her friends. Unlike the death of Matthew Shepard, Gwen's death attracted very little media attention. Gwen was a transgender youth, murdered by young men from her own neighborhood. Gwen Araujo was born in 1985 in San Francisco Bay Area. Her birth name was Eddie, but as she grew up, it became apparent to family and friends that Eddie was a misnomer. She played with dolls, she wanted to be pretty. When she was in the 8th grade, she told a girlfriend that she was different. That she really was a girl. She gave her a ring and asked if they could be best friends. Her girlfriend never took the ring off, even after the murder. When she was 14, she asked her family to call her Gwen, after Gwen Stefani, so they did. Her mother promised her that after she could have sex reassignment surgery, they would legally change her name. Her family was accepting and supportive of her, even when they did not quite understand. Sometimes they used the wrong pronoun, but they kept trying.
When she told me that she didn't identify with her body, I too told her that society was not going to be so accepting.
Her school was less supportive. Students began to harass her. Eventually, she gave up and dropped out. She left school because of incessant bullying and ridicule. Before she could have the surgery, she was killed, beaten to death by three men, so-called friends, all three of them, 5 years her senior. On the morning she was murdered, Gwen Araujo was at a party. Michael Magidson, Jose Merrill, Jason Casares, and Jason Neighbors were also there. She had met the men a year before, and had dated two of them. Early in the morning of October 4th, when the party had died down, some of the men began talking about Miss Araujo, questioning her sex. Merrill shouted at her, "Are you a fucking woman or a man?" Eventually, Nicole Brown, who had been visiting with the group, suggested they bring Gwen into the bathroom to check. Brown placed her hand up Miss Araujo's skirt, touched her genitals, and then pronounced Gwen a fucking man. The four men then brutally murdered Gwen. They punched and kicked her. They pounded her head against the wall with a frying pan and can of soup, leaving dents in the wall behind her. They then strangled her to death. Sometime in the middle of the ordeal, Neighbors and Casares drove to Casares' home, retrieved a shovel, drove back to the Merrill's house, and beat Gwen with the shovel. They then drove to the Sierra foothills and buried her body in a shallow grave. Afterward, they went to McDonald's for breakfast.
For the longest time, I would just hear her scream, and I'd replay it in my head over and over. I could hear her say, "Please don't do this to me, I have a family." You know, just to think about all the pain that she suffered that night, and then nobody to help. It was just hard.
Nearly 2 weeks passed before Gwen's body was discovered by the authorities. Partygoers present, for fear of reprisal, did not report the crime that had occurred, and the assailants all agreed not to say a word to anyone about the matter. Later, however, one of these men began talking to a friend and then wrote about his experience to his girlfriend from the jail where he was being held. Alameda County Sheriff's Department dispatched 4 crime scene investigators and 2 detectives who recovered the body at the gravesite. On October 16, 2002, the officers were led by Jaron Neighbors, the youngest of the 4 individuals charged with her murder and hate crime. The 4 accused of the murder are Michael Magidson, 27, Jaron Neighbors, 19, Jose Merrill, 24, and Jason Casares, 23. Jaron Neighbors later testified against the other 3 in a deal with the DA for a lesser charge of manslaughter after police monitored a jailhouse letter and information gained during a conversation with one of the accused using a wiretap. Magidson, Merrill, Neighbors, and Casares. At trial, Neighbors testified that Araujo had consensual sex with a few men before it was revealed that she was biologically male. Araujo was beaten and strangled to death, hogtied, wrapped in a blanket, and buried in the Sierra Nevada foothills. In exchange for his testimony against the other defendants, neighbors pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter. The other 3 men, charged with first-degree murder and committing a hate crime, invoked the transgender panic defense, claiming that the victim provoked the attack by having sex under pretenses. By invoking this defense, Magidson and Merrill were convicted of second-degree murder and acquitted of the hate crime. Casares pleaded no contest to voluntary manslaughter. Merrill and Magidson were both sentenced to 15 years to life in state prison. Casares was prosecuted along with Merrill and Magidson at 2 highly publicized trials in 2004 and 2005, but jurors deadlocked on his fate at both trials. He pleaded no contest to the lesser charge of voluntary manslaughter in December 2005. So he wouldn't have to risk a murder conviction at a 3rd trial, and was sentenced 1 month later to 6 years in state prison. Jurors deadlocked on the fate of all 3 defendants at their first trial in 2004, and Merrill and Magidson were convicted at the end of the 2nd trial. Casares and neighbors have both been out of prison for many years. The story of Gwen's life has been celebrated and kept alive by her mother, Sylvia Guerrero. She supported Gwen when she transitioned as a teenager, and in the act of love and respect, had her child's name legally changed to Gwen after the murder. Guerrero fought the possible parole of Magidson and asked for parole for Merrill, while other family members want neither paroled. Merrill, who has expressed remorse from the beginning but admitted that back then, he felt more sorry for himself, and that he didn't understand the depths of what he has done until his own daughter, who was gravely disabled, died in 2011. According to Guerrero, Magidson was called out for being unrepentant at his sentencing, and still has not shown remorse. His first parole board hearing had just gotten underway in Chowchilla, on Wednesday, when he stipulated that he was unsuitable for parole. Magidson had a poor prison record, told the parole board he needed more self-help, including drug and alcohol treatment. Merrill has had a good prison record and, unlike Magidson, has sought addiction treatment while incarcerated. However, Guerrero considered Magidson and Jason Casares the principal actors in the killing. Casares pleaded no contest to voluntary manslaughter in exchange for a 6-year sentence after 2 juries couldn't agree to a verdict. The youngest man charged, Jaron Neighbors, led police to Gwen's body, hogtied and weighted down with rocks in a shallow grave in the Sierra Mountains, and then testified against the others. He pleaded to involuntary manslaughter and was sentenced to 11 years in prison. Casares reportedly now living in a rural area outside of the Bay Area, and neighbors working at the same East Bay restaurant that employed him before the killing. Guerrero said, Michael Magidson was the mastermind. It was premeditated between him and Jason. Of the 4 men, I blame them for the fatal injuries.
My hope is that no town ever has this kind of tragedy, but I would be naive if I thought it will never happen again.
2, 4, 6, 8.
And if it should ever happen in another town, that town has to be willing to take and accept responsibility.
There's something to be gotten from it is that everyone had to confront their own feelings about their unsureness when it comes to issues like gender and power and motive and what's acceptable and what isn't. I mean, I certainly did.
Out of her tragedy, I want to bring something positive in her memory. It does help to know that some people are learning and listening, and there is changes occurring.